Hi there, in this session we're going to learn how to take HTML and CSS to format anchor tags. You can see in the quick example I've got here, I've got a nav bar and I've got some anchor tags in here. You can see my mouse cursor change to let you know that they are indeed links. And we're going to figure out how to do that without images, with just doing it with HTML and CSS. So to start, we'll fire up our favorite code editor and we'll start coding in our basic HTML. I'll start with my doc type, and I'll go through my basic HTML tags. Now I will go ahead and put a reference to a CSS file. I'm going to give it a title called Formatting Anchor Tags. I'll go ahead and put in a link tag that will reference a CSS file that I'll create in a little while. And I'll simply refer to that as style.css. So there's my basic skeleton. I'll go ahead and save this to a root folder. Want to make sure that I've got a folder here that I've already created for this, and I'm going to save this as my index file, index.html. And depending on your code editor, of course, your code may color itself at that point to kind of help you out to see if there's any mistakes there. Now I'm just going to start out with some basic anchor tags. We'll do a nav bar a little bit later, but to start out, I just want to drop in a basic anchor tag. Something like this. A stands for anchor, href is hyperreference or hypertext reference, and essentially this is a link to my home page. Home page is always index.html. I've got the word home, and then I've got my closing anchor tag. Now remember that the text in black is what you typically will see on the front end of your browser. So in this case, I've got my title that will appear up in my tab at the top of the browser, and I've got my home button. And it doesn't mean the text will show up as black, but it certainly means that that's all it should show up. So I'll go ahead and save this, and I'd like to go ahead and view this in a browser. So I will drag that down into my browser. And there we go. So I've got this button. It might appear blue and underlined. It might appear purple. In most cases, if it's a page you haven't been to yet, it'll be blue. And if it's a page that you have been to, it'll be purple. And in this case, we're on the page, so we've been there and it's purple. We'll change that as well. I'm going to throw in a couple of more anchor tags. And I'll just link those to some imaginary pages that I've not made yet. Maybe an about page and a contact page. Something like that. So all three anchors, they're respectively going to index, about, and contact. And we'll save that, go back to our browser. And now we can see that we indeed have blue underlined text. Blue underlined text is the standard default look for an anchor tag, and it always has been that way ever since the web first exploded out in the 90s. And purple is what we call the visited color. A little bit more about that later. So the first thing I really want to do is maybe to go ahead and put these inside of a nav, of a layout tag. Nav is the HTML5 tag that we use to put all of our navigation buttons in. And by doing so, I shouldn't see any visual changes. When I save this and go back to my browser, I don't see any changes there, nothing really looks any different, but it will here momentarily. I'm ready to start my CSS. I'm probably done with my HTML for this session. I don't think there's anything else we'll have to add, but we will need to go through and add some CSS to format these. So I'm going to go ahead and do a File, New, text window to give myself an area to type in some CSS code. I've still got my HTML open back there. And let me make this font large so you can see it better. And I'll start out with the basic nav tag. Now this is going to be my CSS. And I just want to add some basic design elements to this. I'd like to put a background color on this. And I'm not even going to look up the color number. I'm just going to type orange and hope for the best. It'll be orange, but it'll be kind of bright. I'm also going to add a height to this. And I'll add a height of maybe something like 40 pixels. And I'll save this. I'll save it to the same root folder that I had earlier. And I'm going to save it as style.css. Style.css. It has to be saved as style.css because when we had that reference to our HTML or from our HTML moments ago, style.css is what we saved that as. So we're going to go ahead and save that. Now, assuming we got the file name right, saved it to the same root folder, all of that, we should see this. Now, I didn't put a width on the nav, so it doesn't really matter if it's by itself or if it's in the container or if it's somewhere else. It's going to take up the full width of whatever element it's in, and I'm okay with that for right now. Now, if I'd like to add one more thing to the nav at this point, it's something called text align center. Text align center. This is a CSS property and value that can center just about anything. You can center images, you can center text. It's not really just about words. You can center other things. But anytime you put text align center on any sort of HTML block element, div tags, header, footer, nav, section aside, anything like that, it's going to center whatever's inside of that element. So the difference that we get at this point is that now all of our buttons are centered. And maybe you want them to be centered and maybe you don't, but I'm going to go ahead and center mine for right now. The next thing we need to do is actually format the anchor tags themselves. When I'm looking here at the anchors, they're Times New Roman or whatever my default font is on my computer. They're blue, they're underlined, they're not aligned, they're just kind of ugly. So I want to go through some really common CSS properties and values that we might use to touch that up and make that look a little better. So in this case, I'll start by placing my new rule, and it's going to be nav space A. And if you've never seen two items in the selector before, in the title of the CSS rule, this is where cascading comes in. You know, CSS, the C stands for cascading style sheet, and cascading is really kind of a hard thing to explain until you've seen it done a few times. But the way cascading works is that every time you put a space in another element, you're essentially saying inside of. So in this case, the anchors that are inside of my nav tag. The anchors inside of nav. Now, by simply saying nav A, I'm only formatting the anchors inside the nav tag. That way, if I've got other anchors elsewhere, and maybe I've got some in my articles or my paragraphs, I don't want those to be formatted with what I'm about to do. I'm specifically formatting the anchors in the nav tag. That's why we're actually doing the nav tag in this example. So I'm going to throw out a few basic things here. First of all, we'll do font size. And I'll do 24 pixel. Font size of 24 pixel. That will change our look to this. I'll also add font family, and I'll try Arial. Save and refresh, changes that. I'll do color, and I want black. You can either write out the word black or pound 000 for no color. Save and refresh. So these three CSS properties and values are pretty basic, pretty common. If you've looked at any CSS before, you've probably seen them quite a bit. Now I'm going to add a few that I typically just reserve for anchors. Text decoration is one of those. And text decoration of none will remove the underline. We rarely use text decoration as a property unless we're planning on taking away something like underline. Other choices you can use, I believe strike through is an option. There may be a few others, but this is actually the most common, is not to add a text decoration, it's to subtract one. And that does the trick, that gets rid of those. I'm going to go ahead and add a font weight of bold. It's a quick and easy way to bold our text. Font weight of bold, just to make those a little bit stronger. And I'm pretty happy with the way that's going so far. The next task is I really want to align them vertically in the middle of the orange nav bar here. Now the orange nav bar is 40 pixels tall. And I know that because I told it to be. A few moments ago I gave it a height of 40 pixels. Now here's a secret. If you want to vertically align text in the middle of a layout element like a nav bar, the trick that you'll use is actually line height. It has nothing to do with alignment really. All we're really doing is adjusting the line height so that it matches the height of the nav bar. Now typographically, every font has a baseline and it has an imaginary line that the text will fall in. When you increase the line height, it essentially centers the text in the middle of that big imaginary line. So as I click and drag to highlight some text, you see how this highlights in blue? Theoretically you could say, well, that's the line height. Now if I made that blue box taller somehow and it still centered the text, it would vertically align my text in the blue box. So what we're doing here is simply saying the line height of our text is the same height as our nav, and the result is that it will now vertically align. And I'm pretty happy with the way that turned out. I think the last thing I really need to do for the basic formatting, before we start getting into the button states, is maybe a little bit of spacing. Now if you've dealt with space and CSS before, or watched any of my other videos about space and CSS, you know that margin and padding are the two properties that allow us to do that. Now ultimately, margin is going to win. But I'm going to do padding first because I want you to see the mistake that it causes. It's a really hard mistake to see. That's why I'm going to show you and point it out. I'm going to add some padding in there of, let's say, 50 pixels. And when I do this, it's probably going to blow out the nav a little bit. So I got all this space now between this, each one of my anchors. And really, by saying 50 pixel pad, it's saying 50 on all four sides, top, bottom, left, and right. It didn't add it to the top and bottom because my nav has a height of 40. But if we're really trying to be the most efficient here, we should do 0 and 50. 0 will add the pad to the top and bottom, which I don't want, so 0 makes the most sense. 0 on the top and bottom, and 50 to the right and left. Now please note that that's 50 to the right and 50 to the left. If you're glancing at this and saying, man, that looks like way more than 50 pixels, it is. It's 100 pixels. It's adding 50 to the right of home button and 50 to the left of about. It's adding 50 to the left and right of every button. And we don't really care about the space out here. We don't care about the space out here, but the 50 is adding essentially 50 on each side of these, resulting in 100 pixels in between. Now here's the problem with padding. Okay, you notice when I hover over these buttons, my cursor changes to the hand? Well, watch this. When I move my cursor over to the left or to the right, it's still the hand. Technically speaking, when you add padding, you're adding space to the inside of the button. Therefore, you're allowing yourself to click anywhere in between here. Now, this is where things get confusing. You see my mouse there is about halfway between home and about. It's slightly closer to home, but if you click now, it'll still go to home. you can see my mouse turn when there's a little space inside of there. That's the separation between the two. But really, I don't want all of this space to be clickable. I want to eliminate any confusion as to, which button am I on now? Am I on home or about? Because they're really, really close. So instead of using padding, I will replace that with the word margin. Now remember, margin and padding essentially do the same thing. They add space around elements, but padding adds it to the inside, margin adds it to the outside. Visually speaking, there's no difference. But when I place my mouse up here now, it doesn't know that these are links. If I touch the word, anywhere on the word and pretty close to it, my cursor changes. But when I go to these blank spaces, it doesn't. And that's a good thing. Now you can mix and match that a little bit. If you want a little bit of padding and some margins, you can do that to make the clickable area of your link a little bigger. So you can use padding and margin. And you're welcome and encouraged to experiment with that some. So in a nutshell, this is a great way to format your anchor tags, no matter whether they're in a nav bar or not. Okay, we've added some formatting to that. Now the next thing I want to show is how to do, maybe instead of centered along the nav bar, maybe have it left aligned with some space in between. So I'm going to remove the text align center out of here. And that's going to force our links to be from the left edge. 50 pixels from the left. I've got 50 to the right and 50 more here. Now, if you really want a certain distance from the left, but you want to add more to the right, I'll show you another trick here. We're going to keep that same margin and padding. Margin. I still want 0 on the top and bottom, but my left and right are going to vary. Now, if it helps to actually see these written out, you're welcome to do that. Margin top, margin bottom, margin left, margin right. And I will do that. I will go ahead and do the shorthand version just to make it a little bit easier on the eyes. I'm sorry, the longhand version. So margin top and margin bottom, I want 0 px. Margin left, I'm going to add in a smaller one, like maybe 20 pixels. And margin right, I'll add in something larger like 50. And what that's going to do is distinguish a certain number of pixels from the left edge. I may have some other alignment issues where maybe I want to align home with the logo above it or the paragraphs below it, and I need that to be about 20 pixels, but I don't want it to be 20 pixels in between. So the way that we accomplish this is you give it a margin left, and that will be your left edge. You can make that whatever you want. I'll increase it to 30 just to see the difference here. You see it jump up a little bit more, 10 more pixels. But I don't want 30 pixels between each one. I'd like more space than that. That's where margin right comes in. This is really developing the space between those links. Now, I still have to do that math. I can't look at this and say, oh, there's 50 pixels because there's margin right of 50 pixels. That's true, but there's also another 30 to the left. So when I'm looking at home here, I've got 50 pixels to the right of home and another 30 pixels to the left. If you're just eyeballing it for the design and you don't really have to know how many pixels, this works really, really well. So if you want less space, just make your margin right even less. So even when I do 30 and 30, you think, well, it should be the same on the left and the right. Not true, because we've got 30 on the left, 30 on the right, 30 on the left, 30 on the right. That makes this 60. So that's a pretty big deal. Now, the last phase of this is I want to go through something called button states or anchor states. You've probably heard of rollover effects or hover effects, and that's essentially what we're about to do. Now, if you don't want any of those effects, you can leave this as is and all is well. But if there are things that you want to change about each button state, you're welcome to do that. Now, there are 4 of these, and I'm going to tab down a little bit. There are 4 of these, and I'll write all 4 of them out first, and they need to be in order. So we've got nav a colon link, nav a colon visited, nav a colon hover, no space in between there, hover, and lastly we've got nav a active. So link, visited, hover, and active. Those are your 4 anchor subselectors. Now these are actually called subselectors. A lot of people refer to them as button states or anchor states, but there's 4 different looks or colors, if you will, for links on the web without any sort of images. Link is the default look. A link as it stands, as it's, without any sort of formatting. That's what it should be. Now, if I want that to be black, what I should do is really come up here and take that black out of my nav A and paste it down here under under nav A link. So when my default color is black, visited is a link after you've clicked on it. Now in most cases it's purple. Okay, your regular link color is blue and your visited is purple. The hover and active don't have defaults. So when a link has been visited, I want it to be, I'll just say green. We'll make each one of these drastically different. Hover is our first really new subselector in terms of not seeing it with a default. In this case, I'd like to make the color blue. So when I hover over it, it's going to turn blue. Now if I save that and go check this out as is, I see now my home is turned green because green is my visited color. When I hover over these, they turn blue because blue is my hovered color. And the last one down there is one called active, and to be honest, this is kind of a waste. For most basic websites, active is not even something that most viewers are going to see. Active is as you're clicking it. If the mouse button is a mouse down and mouse up, if you're clicking a mouse, it's the first half of that. So it's half of a mouse click. By the time people release the mouse, they're gone to another page. So this is nothing but a flicker. Now I'm going to change it to red so you can see what happens. I'll refresh it. I don't see any changes. Now, I don't have any of these links made, so whenever I click any of these, it's probably going to either go to the same page or break, but I'll do a regular click. Ready? Here we go. Did you see that flicker of red in there? If I click and hold my mouse button is still down. I'm holding my mouse button and it's red, and as soon as I let go, it goes back to one of the other colors. So my link, a link subselector is black. That's them in their default state. Visited is green. That means I've already been to that page today. Hover is blue. So as I hover or roll over, it turns blue. And as I click it, it's turning red. And that's certainly not one that you have to do. A lot of people leave that off, but it's the 4th option. Now, last note, these do need to be in this order. One kind of trumps the other. So if you rearrange the order, then there's a chance that a visited link would not hover if you rearrange these two. The hover would never show because it would always stay green for visited. You can experiment with the order, but the W3 says this is the order that you should go through to make sure that they all work all the time. So that's a lot of information. If there's anything else you want to do in the subselectors, you certainly can. If you want to change the font size to make it bigger when you hover over it, or if you want to change its font weight, you can do something like that. It's not real common, but it is certainly possible. I'll throw you one more example here. If I add a text decoration back in here, text decoration underline on hover, what should happen is now when I hover over it, the underline shows back up. And it only shows on hover simply because I added that on the hover. So hopefully this helps you out with formatting your anchor tags and shows you how to do that whether you're inside of a div or a nav tag or not. But good news about this is pretty much it as far as formatting anchors. You can add more CSS properties and values, but there's no specific code like these subselectors we've got here. This is about all there is to it. So hopefully that makes sense to you, and hopefully you learned a lot. So if you need anything, shoot me an email or add a comment in the comments below, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.